So, in the first part, I started to cover practice evaluation and really provide an overview around the purpose of practice evaluation, but why is it that we want to evaluate our practice with individual clients? And where we left off is highlighting what the process of practice evaluation is. And the first piece that I underscored was that the first part is around acquiring information about the prospective client. And the ways I describe that is that we gather information through different ways, initially through an intake, um, followed by different assessments we may complete with an actual a client to really get a true understanding of who the client is. We then establish a baseline, and then based on the baseline, we develop interventions, including identifying an appropriate intervention and conducting the intervention, and then potentially conducting follow up. The next phase that we're going to begin to talk about is assessment, what the assessment process is. So, the first part around the assessment that we want to be thinking about is identifying and defining the problem. So, what that translates into is whatever the presenting problem is, we want to be clear around identifying it, but also defining it. So, in this context, we want to be able to operationalize the identified problem for the purposes of measurement. So we recall the case study of Jane that we discussed last week. Jane presented with anxiety, also being worried, but also experiencing levels of obsessiveness as well. So, for us to be able to accurately measure the identified problem, we want to make sure that we begin to kind of define or operationalize what worried is, what anxiety can look like, but also obsessive behavior or obsessive thoughts. What that allows us to do is to make sure that we are ensuring that we are appropriately assessing the identified problem. And so, to that end, what it allows us to then do is to begin to collect measures related to the problem. And of course, one approach that we use is oftentimes a clinical interview. This is one approach that we know as social workers we use to obtain information from clients from numerous sources. The other ways that we can actually think about assessment is making sure that we've gathered intake forms that are completed by clients, also reports that are provided by others, whether relatives or friends, but also any relevant records that would be important for us, medical, court, psychiatric. So, for example, in the case of Jane, who we know has an existing thyroid issue, it would very much be important to make sure that we get her medical records to see what her treatment plan is connected to her thyroid. And the other assessments that we want to think about are maybe standardized instruments and assessment tools. We also want to be able to think about assessments and their connection to cultural responsiveness. And one element that we want to begin to think about is cultural norms. So when we think about cultural norms, they're referring to attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are shared by members of client's ethnocultural group that may influence the client's definition of the actual problem. These could include social relations, specifically gender roles or hierarchical roles that exist within the cultural group, perception of the self, that is, how the self is defined. Is it individualistically defined or is it collectivistically defined? How an individual's identity is determined, and the pieces around human relations. How is it that individuals within a culture relate to each other? The other pieces are always around culture identification markers. And the first ones are really simplistic in nature, and the other ones become a little bit nuanced. So oftentimes we may identify cultural groups through food or language. But we also know that there are other more complex areas that are identifiers as well, such as family norms and social norms become important. Being culturally responsive as a clinician is significant because we want to be able that we're clear in getting insight into our client's worldview, specifically around how they're defining the problem, and to help us distinguish between attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are culturally mediated and those that are products of individual personalities. So without really taking this deep dive, it's easy to rely on our own lens that already has complexities around our social identities to define a problem for an actual client when the actual client may not actually see it that way. Another layer that we add is just a degree of acculturation. And this oftentimes happens with our immigrant origin clients. Either first generation, they're learning how to exist in a new country, but they're actually existing with their own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors from their actual country of origin, still, while they're existing in a US context. So part of what happens over time is individuals live longer in the US, they become a little bit more acculturated into some of the attitudes, beliefs of the US context, and yet maybe still holding to their own ways of existing in terms of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Another piece we want to be cognizant of is English language fluency. So what this translates into is that culturally responsiveness means that we actually have individuals within a program who will speak the language of our clients to best service them, or we will have interpreters to make sure that the communication between therapist and client is fluid in nature. So we're accounting for these different levels of cultural responsiveness as we're thinking about assessment. So oftentimes to demonstrate the idea around cultural norms and cultural identification markers, we like to kind of highlight the iceberg. And I know many of us have become very familiar around the iceberg. So we always think about what's above the waterline, right? And this is very much surface culture. This is very much explicit, it's visible, and it's actually taught. So what's above that waterline, we can actually see whether it is food that individuals may eat from a particular cultural background, dress, language they may speak, dance. This just gives us one little lens around who our clients actually are. When we begin to actually go just below the waterline, these are areas that are oftentimes what we refer to as unspoken rules. This oftentimes really require us to pay greater attention, and ask and have conversations around, because when we begin to go just below the waterline, what we begin to see is normative ways of individuals actually existing that are more nuanced in nature, but have implications around how it is that we define the core problem for clients, but the ways that they actually respond or do not necessarily respond. So, for example, when we think about patterns of emotions, we know that there are cultural groups who do not demonstrate emotion. And so from our own lens, right, where we may be individuals who emotions allow us to know how individuals are feeling, specifically either visually expressing those emotions, we're able to get that understanding, that connection. But in cultural groups that may not necessarily fully demonstrate their emotions, that means that it's not necessarily a problem, right? But rather it's our own issue that we have to consider. Why is it that a demonstration of emotion is important? But further, what implications does it have around diagnosing what the core issue is for clients. The next piece is oftentimes around also when we think about eye contact is also culturally situated as well. So when we begin to go even way below the waterline, these are the areas where there's unconscious rules. And these are the areas that become very blurred because it's more of this hidden culture. This is culture that is inculcated. This is culture that how individuals operate on a day-to-day basis. And it's so deep. And so when we think about the ways that when we're working with clients and how they may define a problem, it is very much situated in this greater context of deeper culture. But also, it's back to ourselves, thinking about we're bringing our whole cultural lens into our interactions. In our own cultural lens may create levels of blind spots for us and biases that when we see individuals who operate different than who we actually are, it would be easier to say, oh, seems like a problem, even though for that cultural group, it might not necessarily be a problem. And those areas around understanding problem solving roles, right? Who takes on those roles within a family, within a cultural group. So to be able to unpack that further, um, perspectives around tone of voice become important. The ways that uh, individuals develop self also become very important. For some, in a US context, the self expresses itself individually, where in other contexts, other cultural groups, they think about it expressing itself collectively. And so, to that end, when we begin to look at the whole picture around the cultural iceberg, we see its complexity. And it's important for us to kind of hold that complexity because even as we think about assessments, right? Assessments that have been created that have not necessarily been culturally responsive to clients and communities that are historically marginalized, we're still kind of holding what are those layers that we actually have to be able to take a deeper dive around. What are the questions that I have to ask that are going to give me more of a cultural lens and perspective to really understand the root causes of the problem that the client has brought to see me about. But further, we want to add the layers around where microaggressions live, where racism lives, as well, to be able to unpack those pieces and how much is it then connected to particular symptoms that clients may actually be expressing that can easily be missed if we don't ask a range of questions, but if we don't use a range of assessments to actually assess the specific problem. And so I want to highlight some common measurements that we can actually use. But what I want to also say is that relying on one measurement oftentimes is not enough. We want to make sure that we have multiple measurements to actually assess the presenting problem. So the first one is one that we're very much familiar with: standardized instruments. And when we think about standardized instruments, they have been tested with numerous individuals and usually do not vary over repeated administration, right? So that means that there's levels of reliability and validity that exist in standardized instruments. The caution around standardized instruments that we want to think about is if we're going to use standardized instruments, we want to make sure that we're clear around who's been assessed with those standardized instruments to develop validity and reliability of the actual standardized instruments as a whole. Because we want to make sure that we're holding what it means to have culturally relevant standardized instruments as well. Another area that we can consider in measurement is self-anchored scales. And so self-anchored scales are measures developed between the clinician and the client for use by the client to assess the extent of a problem the client is actually experiencing. So what's happening here is that both the client and the clinician are developing the actual measure together. So what this allows then is for clients to define what the problem is for them. And based upon what they're defining it to be, then alongside the clinician, they're able to really create a meaningful skill that relies on the client's experiences, given their specific social identities that they're bringing into into the session. The next one is around rating scales. And rating scales are completed by someone other than the client to assess the severity of the problem being experienced by the client. So what this sometimes looks like is teacher rating scales. It could be a parent rating scale. So what's happening here is that the teacher or parent may be rating the severity of a problem on behalf of a child, on behalf of an adolescent, or even on behalf of an adult. The next one is systematic observations. And this oftentimes includes directly observing the client's behavior and systematically recording those specific observations. So oftentimes systematic observations work well in school settings where if social workers interested in seeing behavioral patterns of students or a student, they're able to go into the classroom and continuously observe how students may be behaving in a classroom setting or in other settings as well as a point of measurement. And the last one is response to interviews and surveys, right? Interviews being asking clients questions around how they define the problem for themselves, to be able to hear from clients themselves around their perceptions of the actual problem, and just to hear what they perceive being some of the reasons for the specific presenting problem. Just like we talked about in program evaluation, we're still considering where cultural relevancy, measurement equivalency, age appropriateness, and educational level and cognitive challenges are a consideration in selecting measures. I just talked about the significance around cultural relevancy in measurements and what are the layers we have to be thinking about, but what are potential approaches in measurement. Measurement equivalency is does the actual measurement hold similar understanding in terms of core concepts in that measurement by cultural groups, right? So do cultural groups have a similar understanding of some of the questions that are being asked of them that are meaningful to them? Age appropriateness, obviously, we have to make sure that the measure is appropriate given the age of the client. Educational level, we want to make sure that it matches clients' educational level in terms of measurements, because when this doesn't happen and individuals are not understanding the questions that are being asked of them, they may not actually respond accurately. So now we have a problem of reliability in terms of being able to measure the presenting problem. And obviously, when we have individuals who have cognitive challenges, we want to make sure that the measures themselves are responsive to a client's needs. So once we actually determine what are going to be the measurements to actually assess the presenting problem to then generate a baseline, there's a few things we want to think about. So in here, we want to be able to use repeated measures. And specifically, what I said a little bit earlier, right? We just can't rely on one measurement to actually assess the problem. If we're just simply relying on one scale, we're going to miss a continuum of pieces of what the client is actually experiencing. Because through repeated measures, what we're able to do is really confirm the existence, the frequency, and the severity and the duration of the actual problem. So confirming the existence is really translating into how is the problem actually existing, how often, and how severe is it, and over what period of time has it actually been existing. The next piece is it allows us to see how significant the magnitude of the problem is that would warrant an intervention, right? So magnitude being how strong is the actual presenting problem that it's going to actually warrant an intervention. And it also allows us to confirm the relationship between the presenting problem and the prospective factors that are causing the problem. And that's why when I talked about the need to be more intentional around thinking about the baseline, this is going to probably take more than one session to really determine what are the pieces that are actually causing the specific problem, because we want to be a little bit more thorough than just do a couple assessments and then from there identify goals and start treatment. We want to be more intentional around what is the association between the presenting problem and the prospective factors that may actually be causing the problem for the client. So that means it's going to take a little bit longer as you're thinking about your practice evaluation proposal. That means you want to lay out in week one, what are you going to do to begin to assess the presenting problem? In week two, what are the layers that you may actually add based upon what you might have missed in your session, in your first session? And probably in session three, what you're doing is now connecting some of the prospective factors that are contributing to the problem. So what follows from here is that we collect the data based on the presenting problem, but we've administered whether it's standardized scales, whether is we've created a self-anchored scale with clients, whether we've done systematic observations, whatever the approach is, we've collected the data. We've analyzed the data, and for some, we might have actually graphed the data that will give us a picture view around the magnitude of the problem, but also the presence and the severity of the problem that the client is presenting with. This will then determine whether an intervention is actually warranted. So through this process of actually collecting multiple data sources, it will inform whether an intervention will be warranted or not.